Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The Fire Lookout. I worked 3 seasons as a fire lookout for the Forest Service, back when I was in my late 20s and looking for a job that would pay me to be alone with my thoughts for months at a stretch. If you've never spent time around the job, the basic shape of it is simple. You live in a small cabin built on top of a tower, sometimes 40 or 50 feet up, sometimes built right on a peak with no need for height at all. And your job is to watch the horizon for smoke, log weather, and call it in if you see something. Most days are uneventful by design. That's the point. The lookout I'm describing was in a national forest in the Pacific Northwest, on a peak with a sight line across maybe 30 miles of forested ridges in good weather, with 2 or 3 other peaks visible in the distance that had lookouts of their own, some staffed, some not, depending on the year and the budget. Part of the job, especially at night, is watching for any kind of light out there that shouldn't be, a campfire in a closed area, a vehicle on a road that's supposed to be gated, that kind of thing. You get used to knowing what's out there and what isn't, to the point where you can usually tell, just from the quality and steadiness of a light at a distance, roughly what's producing it before you even reach for the binoculars. This was my second season, about 6 weeks in, well into the part of the summer where the routine has fully set in and the days have a sameness to them that some people find boring and I found genuinely restful. I want to establish that up front because what follows isn't the account of someone bored out of their mind and inventing things to break the monotony. I like the monotony. I wasn't looking for anything to happen. My first season had been entirely uneventful in this particular respect. Plenty of smoke calls, a couple of genuine fire starts that kept things interesting in the ordinary, professional sense of the job, but nothing like what I'm about to describe, and nothing that made me think the job carried any kind of strangeness beyond the usual isolation that comes with the territory. There was one other staffed lookout within my sightline that season, on a peak maybe 11 miles distant as a straight line, slightly lower in elevation than mine, staffed by a guy named Ron who'd been doing the job for almost 15 years and who I talked to most evenings on the radio, mostly just to check in and trade notes on weather coming in, the kind of low-stakes companionship that 2 isolated people develop even at a distance. He'd trained me my first season, taught me how to take a bearing on smoke with the firefinder, how to tell the difference between a dust devil and an actual column of smoke at a distance, the dozens of small skills that don't come naturally and that nobody really explains to you in the orientation paperwork. The job itself, if you've never done it, has a rhythm that takes some adjusting to. You're up before dawn most days, doing your weather observations on a fixed schedule, scanning the horizon every 20 minutes or so during fire season, logging conditions, and otherwise left almost entirely to your own devices for the rest of daylight. The radio is your only regular human contact, sometimes for weeks at a stretch if your supply hike doesn't line up with anyone else's schedule. People who can't tolerate that kind of isolation don't last long in the job. I tolerated it fine. I liked it, in fact, more than almost any job I've had before or since. About midway through that second season, I started noticing a light on a third peak, one that according to my maps and according to Ron didn't have a staffed lookout at all that year. It had one once, decades back, but the tower had been decommissioned and partially dismantled long before either of us took our jobs, with nothing left up there but a foundation and some old hardware bolted into the rock. The first time I saw it, it was just after full dark, a single point of light, steady rather than flickering, in roughly the spot where the old tower would have stood. I assumed at first it was a hiker with a headlamp or a small group camped illegally that high, which happens occasionally even in country that hard to reach, and made a note of it in my log the way I'm trained to, without much alarm. It was still there an hour later. Still steady. Not moving the way a headlamp moves when someone's walking around camp. Not flickering the way a campfire does even on a still night. Just a fixed point of light, roughly where the platform of the old tower would have been, at an elevation and in terrain that would have made it an enormously difficult hike to reach after dark. With no trail, I was aware of that when anywhere near it. I called Ron on the radio, mostly out of curiosity, and asked if he could see it from his angle. He could. He confirmed the same thing I was seeing. A single steady light, on the old tower site. No flicker, no movement, nothing that read as a normal campfire or headlamp to either of us. He said he'd seen lights up there before, a handful of times over the years, and that it never amounted to anything when he mentioned it to dispatch, who generally treated it as low priority since there was no fire risk associated with a light that wasn't moving and wasn't producing smoke. He said dispatch had a standard, slightly weary response to that kind of report, something along the lines of noting it for the record and moving on, the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug, which told me this wasn't the first time someone had radioed in exactly this observation over the years, even if nobody upstream seemed inclined to do anything more with it than file it away. I watched it for close to 3 hours that first night before it simply wasn't there anymore. No fade, no flicker, no sense of someone extinguishing a lantern or letting a fire die down. I looked away to log something in my notebook, looked back up within what felt like a minute or two, and it was gone. I scanned the ridge for a long time after that, in case it had been a small fire that had simply burned low, but there was nothing, no glow at all, nothing consistent with embers settling. The third time I saw it, a couple of weeks later, something happened that I still don't have a comfortable explanation for. I'd taken to keeping a small lantern lit in my own cabin window on the nights I expected to be watching late, more out of habit than purpose, and at some point that night, without thinking much about it, I turned that lantern toward the distant peak and gave it 2 slow, deliberate sweeps, the kind of thing you might do as a half-serious experiment, more curiosity than expectation. The light on the far peak dimmed, briefly, then returned to its previous steady brightness, in a way that felt, and I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds, like it had registered the gesture rather than simply flickered on its own. I didn't try it again that night, or any night after. I told myself it was coincidence, a cloud passing overhead, anything but what it had actually felt like in the moment. I never mentioned that particular detail to Ron, and I'm not sure why, except that saying it out loud felt like it would make the whole thing more real than I was prepared for it to be. It came back 4 more times that season, by my count, always at night, always in roughly the same spot, always with that same steady, unmoving quality that never matched a campfire or a headlamp in any of the ways I'd come to expect from watching both for 2 full seasons by that point. I started logging it carefully each time, duration, approximate time of appearance and disappearance, any change in intensity, the weather conditions and moon phase on each occasion in case there was some environmental factor I was missing, partly out of professional habit and partly because writing it down made it feel more like data and less like something I was supposed to be unsettled by. I went back through my notebook later that winter and found no pattern to the timing beyond the fact that it always happened on clear, calm nights, never when wind or weather might have explained a fire being deliberately set and then quickly abandoned. Ron saw it most of those times too, independently confirming what I was seeing from his angle 11 miles away, which ruled out a few of the easier explanations. A reflection off my own tower's windows, some artifact of my own eyes adjusting to the dark after staring at a logbook under lamplight, a trick of fatigue specific to my own perception rather than a feature of the actual landscape. 2 people watching from 2 different angles, seeing the same fixed point of light in the same spot at the same time, removes a fair amount of the simplest explanations right out of the gate. We even tried, once, to triangulate it properly using our firefinders the way we would for an actual smoke sighting, taking simultaneous bearings over the radio and plotting where the lines crossed on our maps. They crossed almost exactly on the old tower's foundation, give or take a margin that our instruments couldn't really improve on at that distance. What I never did, in 3 full seasons on that mountain, was hike out to that old tower site myself to look at it up close. Partly that's because the terrain made it a serious undertaking, a full day's hike each way through country with no maintained trail, not something you do on a whim when you're supposed to be staffing your own post. But I'll admit, honestly, that there was more to it than logistics. Some part of me preferred not knowing, the way you sometimes prefer to keep a strange noise in another room unexplained rather than go check, because checking carries its own kind of risk that not checking doesn't. Toward the end of that second season, I asked Ron directly whether he had any theory about what it was, expecting the kind of dismissive, practical answer career lookouts often give to younger staff still spooked by ordinary backcountry strangeness. Instead, he got quiet for a moment on the radio, which from a man who'd never struck me as easily rattled in 15 years of doing this, told me something on its own before he said anything else. He said he'd asked around himself, years back, after his own first sighting, talking to retired lookouts who'd worked that district decades earlier, back when the tower on that peak had still been staffed. A couple of them, independently, without him leading the conversation, mentioned lights seen at night on neighboring peaks that had no business having anyone up there. Not always the same peak, but always old decommissioned sites, always at night, always steady rather than flickering. Nobody had an explanation. A couple of them used the phrase "still on watch," half joking, the way people use dark humor to handle something they don't actually want to think about too directly. One of them, a man in his 80s by the time Ron tracked him down, apparently told him that he'd seen something similar exactly once in his own career, decades earlier, on a different mountain in a different district entirely, and that he'd never mentioned it to anyone at the time because there hadn't seemed to be any point. What would he have reported, and to whom? And what would they have done with a report of a light that wasn't a fire and wasn't anything else he had a name for? I asked him if he thought it was something to do with the job itself, old lookouts who'd died in the position, maybe, or some folklore specific to the profession that gets passed down without much scrutiny, the kind of story that calcifies into something everyone half believes simply because enough people in a small, isolated profession have told versions of it over the decades. He said he didn't know, and that he'd stopped trying to find an answer that satisfied him years ago, settling instead for treating it the way you'd treat any other feature of the landscape that doesn't behave the way you expect, noted, respected, and not investigated too closely. He said the job teaches you that particular kind of patience whether you want it or not. You spend so many hours simply watching, recording, and not acting, that eventually you get comfortable extending that same patience to things you can't act on at all. I left that job after my 3rd season for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. Better pay elsewhere, a relationship that needed me somewhere with self-service, and I think about that light more than almost anything else from those years. I've looked, since then, into the history of that particular peak, the records of who staffed the original tower before it was decommissioned, hoping to find some detail that would let me feel like I'd resolved something. I found very little. Forest Service records from that era are spotty at best, especially for smaller, less significant lookouts that were taken out of service decades ago and largely forgotten by the agency that once ran them. I did find one brief mention, in a regional history put together by a local historical society, of a lookout on that peak who'd gone missing partway through a season sometime in the 1940s, with no further detail about whether he was ever found or what was eventually concluded about his disappearance. I don't know if that's connected to anything I saw. I'm not even sure it's the same tower, given how vague the description was. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I found it. What I do know is that two people, watching from two separate vantage points 11 miles apart, with no way to coordinate or mislead each other in the moment, saw the same fixed, steady light appear and disappear on the site of a decommissioned tower 5 separate times over the course of one season, in a location that would have taken a full day's difficult hike to reach on foot, with no trail and no obvious reason for anyone to be there after dark. We confirmed it with instruments designed for exactly this kind of observation, the same instruments we used every day to do our actual jobs, and those instruments told us the same thing our eyes did. I don't go looking for the supernatural in my life generally. I'm not a person who sees ghosts in every unexplained noise or shadow, and I spent 3 full seasons in a profession that rewards exactly the kind of careful, skeptical observation that tends to talk people out of jumping to dramatic conclusions. But there's something particular about that job, the isolation, the long hours spent doing nothing but watching a horizon you've memorized down to every ridge and notch, that makes you a careful, patient witness to whatever is actually out there, whether or not you want to be. I watched that light enough times, logged it carefully enough, cross-checked it with another trained observer enough times, that I trust what I saw more than I trust most of the easy explanations I've tried to fit it into since. I don't work as a lookout anymore, and I don't know if that light is still appearing on that mountain most summers, the way it apparently has been for longer than either Ron or I were alive to witness it. But some nights, wherever I am, I still find myself glancing toward the part of the sky where a distant ridge would be, half expecting, half dreading, to find a single steady point of light where nothing should be burning, on watch over country that hasn't had anyone stationed there in decades. I've never gone back to that mountain since I left the job, not even to visit, though I think about driving up that old access road every fire season when the weather turns clear and still, the exact conditions under which I always used to see it. I tell myself I'll go someday, just to stand on my old tower one more time and look across at that other peak in daylight. I haven't gone yet, and some part of me suspects I'm waiting for a reason not to. The logging road. I spent 4 seasons working as a wildland firefighter, mostly initial attack crews out of a base in Northern California, the kind of job that has you driving remote forest roads at all hours, often alone in a truck, often a long way from anyone, responding to small fires, or doing patrol checks on roads that most people never have a reason to drive. If you've spent any time around that work, you know the roads I'm talking about. Old logging grades, some still maintained, some barely passable, cutting through hundreds of square miles of timber with almost no cell coverage and almost no other traffic, especially at night. You learn to be comfortable with that kind of isolation quickly, or you don't last in the job, because a huge percentage of the actual work happens alone, in a truck, on roads that don't show up clearly on any consumer map. This was my 3rd season, late summer, during a stretch of dry lightning that had us running patrol on a network of logging roads in a district I didn't normally work, covering for a crew that was shorthanded after a long fire assignment elsewhere in the state. Dry lightning patrol is its own particular kind of tedious, methodical work. You drive a grid of roads through country a storm has just passed over, watching for any sign of a smoke column starting from a lightning strike, sometimes for 10 or 12 hours at a stretch with nothing to show for it, but confirming, road segment by road segment, that nothing's caught yet. I was driving alone, which wasn't unusual for that kind of patrol work, doing a slow loop through a section of road that hadn't seen maintenance in a few years, checking for smoke after a storm that had passed through the area the night before. It was close to 11 at night when I came around a long bend on a stretch of road I'd never driven before, climbing gradually through dense timber with no real shoulder on either side, just trees pressing close enough that my headlights caught individual trunks flashing past rather than any kind of open view. The radio had gone mostly quiet by that hour, just the occasional check-in from other crews working different sections of the grid, and the kind of static-laced silence between transmissions that you stop noticing after enough seasons, but that still, on certain nights, makes the cab of the truck feel smaller than it actually is. I want to establish, before I go further, that I'd been on shift for almost 14 hours by that point, on minimal sleep, the kind of fatigue that can make anyone second-guess what they think they saw. I've accounted for that in how much weight I give my own memory of what happened, turning it over against everything I know about how exhaustion distorts perception, and I still don't think it explains it. My headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road, well off to the side where the trees gave way to a narrow shoulder, facing away from me, toward the timber rather than toward the road. I slowed instinctively, the way you do for anyone you find on foot in that kind of isolated country at that hour, assuming it was a hiker who'd gotten themselves lost, or possibly someone from a nearby work crew checking on something after the storm, since there had been a small contract crew doing some thinning work in an adjacent unit earlier that week, which was the first explanation my brain reached for and the one I wanted. In that moment, to be correct. As I got closer, several things registered almost at once, in that fast, disorganized way your brain processes a scene before you've had time to properly think about it. The figure was tall, taller than seemed right relative to the trees nearby that I could use for scale, and it was standing in a posture that didn't read as relaxed or natural. Very straight, very still, with an evenness to the stillness that no person standing casually actually holds for more than a few seconds at a time. People shift their weight, adjust their stance, sway slightly, even when trying to stand perfectly still. This didn't do any of that, not even the small, involuntary movements you'd expect from someone simply existing in one spot. I slowed the truck almost to a stop, maybe 40 feet away, intending to roll down the window and ask if they needed anything, the kind of basic check you do reflexively in that line of work, where you genuinely might be the only person who passes a particular stretch of road for days. Before I could, it turned its head toward me, not its whole body, just the head, in a way that struck me immediately as wrong, a kind of motion that didn't match how a neck is supposed to articulate, smooth rather than the slight hitch you'd expect from an actual turn of a human head on human shoulders. It happened quickly, faster than the rest of its apparent stillness would have suggested it was capable of, which made the contrast even more unsettling than the motion itself. I didn't get a clear look at a face. The angle and the distance and the limited light from my headlights conspired against that, and I've turned that over since, both grateful and unsettled by the gap in what I actually saw, wondering on quieter nights whether a clearer look would have resolved something or made it permanently worse in a way I'd never have been able to unsee. What I can say is that the impression I came away with, immediate and visceral rather than reasoned, was that I needed to keep moving and not stop the truck, a kind of certainty that didn't pass through any conscious decision-making process before it arrived, the same way you don't reason your way through pulling your hand off a hot stove. I drove past. I didn't speed up dramatically, didn't want to telegraph anything by overreacting in case it was, despite everything, still just a person who might reasonably wonder why a truck had suddenly accelerated past them, but I also didn't slow further or roll down the window the way I'd originally planned. I watched it in my mirror as long as the road allowed, which wasn't long given the curve I was coming up on, and in that brief window it hadn't moved, hadn't turned further, hadn't taken a step in any direction. Just stood there, facing the road now instead of the timber, watching the truck go, and even in that fractured, mirror-framed glimpse, the stillness read as deliberate rather than passive, the stillness of something choosing not to move rather than something simply standing around. I drove another 2 miles before I let myself slow back down to a normal patrol pace, my hands tighter on the wheel than I usually allow myself to notice, and I radioed in my position and a brief, deliberately vague note about a possible person on foot near that bend, mostly so there'd be some record of where I'd been if anything came of it later, a habit drilled into all of us from training that turned out to feel almost comforting in the moment, a small return to procedure after something that hadn't fit any procedure I'd ever been trained for. Dispatch acknowledged and didn't ask for more detail, which I was grateful for, because I didn't have a good way to describe what I'd seen without sounding like I was describing something other than a person, which at the time I wasn't ready to commit to out loud over a radio channel other crews could hear. I finished my patrol loop that night without seeing anything else unusual, returned to base, and didn't sleep much despite the exhaustion I'd been carrying all shift, lying in my bunk replaying the angle of that head turn over and over, trying to find some mundane motion it actually matched, and coming up empty every time. I told one other person on my crew the next morning, a guy I trusted not to make it into a joke at my expense, someone I'd worked alongside for 2 full seasons by that point, and considered a genuinely careful, unflappable presence on any crew, not someone prone to dramatics. His reaction surprised me. He didn't laugh, didn't offer the obvious explanations I was half expecting, just asked, very specifically, whether the figure had turned its head before or after I'd slowed the truck. That question stopped me cold, because it implied he had some reason to ask it, some prior frame of reference that made the order of events matter to him in a way it hadn't occurred to me to consider as significant. I told him after that the turn had come after I'd already begun slowing, that I'd been the one to initiate any change before it reacted to my presence at all. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when something's been confirmed rather than introduced, and told me, after a long pause where he seemed to be deciding how much he actually wanted to say, that he'd had something similar happen to him 2 seasons earlier, on a different district entirely, a logging road maybe 60 miles from where I'd had my own encounter, also at night, also during patrol work, also alone in a truck on a road he didn't normally drive. His version had the figure standing closer to the road, he said, close enough that he'd gotten a slightly better look at the general shape, even without much more detail on the face, and it had turned toward him before he'd begun slowing rather than after, which he seemed to consider a meaningful difference, though he didn't explain exactly why beyond saying it felt like it meant something about which one of you noticed the other first. He said the same overwhelming, pre-rational certainty had come over him. Keep moving, don't stop, don't roll the window down, and that he'd driven past at normal speed without looking back, deliberately, because some instinct told him that looking back would be a mistake in a way he still couldn't articulate clearly even years later, a feeling he compared to the specific, bodily certainty you get standing too close to a cliff edge, not reasoned out so much as simply obeyed. He hadn't reported his sighting to dispatch at the time, he admitted, specifically because he hadn't wanted it on any kind of record that might follow him professionally, raise questions about his judgment or his fitness for solo patrol work, a concern I understood completely given how I'd softened my own report the night before, sticking to the vague language of a possible person on foot rather than anything closer to what I'd actually seen. He'd told almost no one in the years since, he said, maybe 2 other people total, both of them sworn to a kind of unspoken confidence he hadn't even had to ask for explicitly, and the only reason he was telling me now was that I'd described something close enough to his own experience that keeping quiet about it felt, suddenly, like the wrong call, almost irresponsible given how closely our accounts lined up. We talked for a long while that morning, comparing every detail we could remember, the height, the stillness, the particular wrongness in how the head moved relative to the rest of the body, the overwhelming instinct to keep driving rather than investigate further. We went back and forth over small specifics that neither of us had thought to mention at first, like the exact texture of the silence in the cab in the seconds right before and after, a kind of pressure in the ears that neither of us could attribute to elevation or engine noise, and a lingering, low-grade unease that took each of us most of the following day to fully shake. Neither of us had a theory that felt adequate. We both knew the usual explanations for misidentified figures at night, a road sign at a strange angle, a burn snag silhouetted just right, a trick of fatigue after a long shift, and neither of us believed those explanations covered what we'd actually experienced, especially not the detail about the head turning, which doesn't fit any inanimate object I can think of, and especially not the matching involuntary certainty that told each of us, independently, not to stop. I've asked, carefully and without leading the conversation, a handful of other firefighters and Forest Service employees over the years since whether they've had anything similar happen on remote roads at night. Most haven't, or say they haven't, which I take at face value, since I'm not interested in collecting confirmation bias dressed up as corroboration. But I've gotten 2 more accounts since then, secondhand rather than firsthand, that follow roughly the same shape. A tall figure at the edge of an isolated road at night, an unnatural stillness, a turn of the head that reads as wrong in a way that's hard to specify, and in every case, the same overwhelming compulsion to keep driving rather than stop. One of those second-hand accounts came from a contractor doing road maintenance work in an entirely different national forest, in a different state altogether, told to a mutual acquaintance who passed it along to me only after I'd specifically asked whether they'd heard anything like what I was describing, careful not to plant the details myself before they answered. What strikes me most, turning all of this over months and years later, is how consistent the central detail stays across every version I've collected, despite none of the people involved having any contact with each other or any shared source they could have all picked up the same story from. Nobody describes the figure approaching. Nobody describes it making a sound. The entire experience, in every account, distills down to roughly the same handful of seconds, an unnatural stillness noticed from a distance, a turn of the head as the vehicle slows or approaches, and an immediate, involuntary certainty that the correct response is to keep moving and not look back, a certainty that arrives before any conscious reasoning has time to weigh in on the decision at all. I still work in fire, still drive remote roads alone at all hours during fire season, and I haven't let what happened change the basic shape of how I do my job, because the work requires it, and I'm not willing to let one unexplained night dictate how I operate professionally. But I notice, now, a heightened awareness on certain stretches of isolated road at night, a kind of low-grade vigilance I didn't have before that particular shift, and I've never stopped my truck again for a figure on foot in that kind of country without first slowing down enough to really look before I get close, scanning the shoulder carefully well before I'd otherwise consider it necessary. I also find myself, more than I used to, paying attention to how other people in this line of work talk about isolated roads at night, listening for the particular kind of hesitation that suggests someone's had an experience they're not ready to share outright, the same hesitation my coworker showed before he finally told me his own version. I've started to suspect that this kind of thing circulates quietly within certain professions that put people alone on remote roads after dark. Wildland fire, certainly, but probably utility line workers, certain kinds of surveyors, anyone whose job occasionally strands them on forest roads at hours and in places where almost nobody else has any reason to be. I don't know what was standing at the edge of that road, or what my coworker saw 60 miles away 2 years before me, or what the other 2 people who described similar nights to other colleagues actually encountered out there in that same vast network of logging roads that crisscrosses more remote forest than any of us could ever fully patrol in a single career. I know that whatever it wasn't interested in approaching, only in being seen, briefly, and turning to watch us go. That's a small mercy, I suppose, though it doesn't make the memory of that turning head any easier to set aside on a long night drive through unfamiliar timber, headlights catching nothing but trunk after trunk after trunk, and somewhere out past the reach of the beams, country that goes on for miles with no one in it that any map or any registry would ever be able to account for. The Portage. I've done wilderness canoe trips for close to 20 years, mostly in the boundary waters along the Minnesota-Ontario border, a million-acre network of interconnected lakes and rivers where you travel entirely by canoe and on foot, carrying your gear and your boat over portage trails between bodies of water that don't connect directly. It's the kind of place that still has genuinely remote sections, areas a strong paddling party might not reach for several days from the nearest entry point, with no roads, no cell service, and nothing between you and whatever's actually out there except your own preparation. I've led trips for friends, for family, and a few times for groups through an outfitter, and I've come to know certain entry points and certain interior lake systems well enough that I notice immediately when something about a familiar stretch of trail feels off. This was 6 years ago, a 9-day trip with two friends I'd paddled with for years, Pete and Diane, both experienced enough in their own right that none of us were relying on the others to compensate for inexperience, which matters for what follows because all three of us came away from this trip with roughly the same baseline confidence in what we'd actually witnessed. We were deep enough into the interior that we hadn't seen another party in 4 days, which isn't unusual that far in, but does change the texture of a trip once you register it. A kind of solitude that's different from being merely alone on a single overnight, more total and more enduring the longer it goes on, without any other human presence to break it up. By day 6, that solitude had stopped feeling remarkable and had simply become the baseline condition of the trip, the way isolation eventually does on any long expedition. On day 6, we came to a portage trail I'd used once before years earlier, a longer one than most, close to half a mile connecting two lakes separated by a low ridge, the kind of portage that takes multiple trips to clear with a loaded canoe and several packs, and that leaves you moving back and forth along the same trail repeatedly over the better part of an hour. I remembered it from my earlier trip as unremarkable, just a longer than average carry through typical boreal terrain, nothing in my memory of it that would have primed me to expect anything different this time around. We arrived in the early afternoon, planning to clear the portage and make camp on the lake at the far end before evening, the kind of straightforward, well-practiced logistics that define most days on a trip like this. The trail itself ran through dense boreal forest, spruce and birch mostly, with the kind of thick understory that limits visibility to maybe 20 or 30 feet off the trail, in most places, low brush and deadfall that would make off-trail travel slow and noisy for anything larger than a fox or a marten. About a third of the way across, on my first trip carrying a pack rather than the canoe, I started to feel a specific, persistent sense that I was being paced by something moving parallel to the trail, just out of sight in the trees to my left. I want to be careful describing this, because the woods make all kinds of ordinary sounds that can feel like presents if you're primed to notice them. A squirrel working through dry leaves can sound disproportionately large at a distance. Wind in the canopy can produce a rustle that briefly resembles footsteps, and exhaustion from a long carry has a way of sharpening your imagination right when your judgment is least reliable. I know all of that, and I gave it the benefit of every ordinary explanation as it was happening, running through the list almost like a checklist while I kept walking, refusing to let myself stop or look directly into the brush. But the sound I was hearing didn't fade in and out the way wind does, and it didn't have the erratic stop-start quality of a small animal moving opportunistically through leaf litter. It moved at a steady pace that matched my own walking speed almost exactly, staying roughly level with me for a stretch of maybe 200 yards before falling silent. Exactly the kind of deliberate, sustained pacing that no small animal has any reason to maintain for that long. I mentioned it to my friend Pete when I got to the far end and dropped my pack, framing it as a joke more than a real concern, the way you do when you want to share something without admitting how much it actually unsettled you. Something like, "Watch yourself, I think the woods are following me today." He laughed it off initially, the way I'd hoped he would, but when he went back for his own second carry a few minutes later, he came back faster than his first trip had taken him, breathing harder than the terrain alone would explain, and admitted, a little sheepishly, that he'd had the same sensation, something pacing him in the brush to one side, keeping level with his walking pace for a stretch before dropping away, in almost exactly the same section of trail where I'd noticed it myself. Our third friend, Diane, who'd stayed at the put-in finishing the last of the canoe carries, hadn't experienced anything on her own trips across, which at the time felt like it weakened the case for anything being genuinely out there rather than two tired men spooking each other over an ordinary woodland sound. She teased us both about it good-naturedly over the course of the afternoon, and I remember being grateful for the teasing, honestly, because it gave the whole thing a lighter frame that made it easier to set aside and keep moving. We finished clearing the Portage without further incident and made camp at the far end as planned, ate dinner, and didn't think much more about it as the evening wore on into the kind of easy fatigue that follows a long day of paddling and carrying. It was well after dark, close to midnight by my watch, when I woke to the sound of something moving through our camp, slow, careful steps in the leaf litter just outside the ring of our fire's dying coals. I lay still, the way you do when you're not sure whether announcing you're awake is a good idea, and listened as the steps circled, unhurried, coming close enough at one point that I could hear what sounded like breathing, low and even, before moving off again toward the Treeline. The sound had a kind of patience to it that I found harder to sit within if it had been frantic or aggressive. Frantic would have at least suggested fear or hunger, something with a recognizable motivation. This felt like something simply taking its time, in no hurry at all, perfectly comfortable being close to three sleeping people in the dark. I tracked its position as best I could just from sound alone, picturing the rough shape of our camp in my head. My tent, Pete's a few feet to my left, Diane set slightly apart near the canoe rack, and the steps seemed to pass closest to mine and Pete's, never quite reaching Diane's side of the clearing, though I want to be honest that I have no way of knowing whether that was a meaningful pattern or simply where the terrain made walking easiest. The breathing I mentioned wasn't loud, more a low, steady exhale repeated at intervals, nothing like the huffing or panting you'd associate with an animal that had been moving quickly or was agitated. It sounded, if anything, restful, which is a strange word to use about something circling your tent at midnight, but it's the most accurate one I have. I woke Pete quietly, the way you wake someone when you don't want to startle either of you into making noise, just a hand against his shoulder through the tent wall, and a whispered word, and he heard it too in the last few seconds before it stopped entirely, confirming with a single, wide-eyed nod in the faint glow from the coals that he wasn't imagining it any more than I was. We didn't get out of our tents that night, a decision I still don't entirely understand in hindsight beyond a shared, wordless agreement that staying inside the thin nylon walls felt safer than confirming what was actually out there, even though I know on a logical level that nylon offers no actual protection from anything determined enough to test it. We lay awake for what felt like another hour after the sound stopped completely, neither of us speaking, both of us listening for any sign that it might come back, and at some point exhaustion simply won out over vigilance, because the next thing either of us remembers clearly is the gray light of pre-dawn through the tent fabric and a loon calling somewhere out on the lake. The most ordinary sound in the world suddenly feeling like an enormous relief. Diane, for her part, slept through the entire thing undisturbed, which became its own small point of discussion the next morning, whether it had simply avoided her side of the camp for some reason, or whether she was a heavier sleeper than either Pete or I had given her credit for over the years of trips we'd shared. She took the news of what she'd missed with more composure than either of us managed, mostly amused that we'd both lain rigid in our tents for an hour rather than getting up to actually look, a fair point that neither of us had a particularly good answer for beyond admitting that some decisions made at midnight in the woods don't hold up well to daylight scrutiny. In the morning, we checked the ground around camp carefully, the way you would after any disturbance, looking for tracks in the soft duff and sand near the lake's edge, all three of us working different sections methodically rather than glancing around half-heartedly and declaring the matter closed. We found a partial set of prints close to where the sound had circled nearest to our tents, prints that neither Pete nor I could confidently attribute to anything specific despite years of paddling experience in country, with a healthy population of black bear, moose, and the occasional wolf, all of which we know how to identify from sign alone. They weren't deep, more impressions than full tracks, the kind of soft, sandy soil that doesn't hold detail particularly well, but they showed a stride length longer than I'd expect from any animal we'd normally encounter in that part of the boundary waters, and an arrangement that didn't match the 4-point gait of anything quadrupedal moving at that pace. We photographed what we could find, though the images, when we looked at them again afterward, were frustratingly inconclusive, the kind of ambiguous depression that could be read multiple ways depending on how badly you wanted it to mean something. We didn't have a clean explanation, and none of us pushed hard for one out loud. The way you sometimes collectively decide not to examine something too closely because the examining itself feels like it would make the night before more real than you're ready for it to be. We finished the trip without further incident over the remaining 3 days, paddled out through increasingly familiar lake systems as we got closer to the entry point, and didn't talk about it again until we were most of the way home in the car, somewhere past the last gas station with cell signal, at which point we went over every detail carefully, comparing notes the way people do when they want to make sure they're not the only one remembering something a certain way, double-checking each other's recollection of the breathing, the stride length, the exact hour, until we'd more or less satisfied ourselves that none of us had embellished or misremembered anything significant in the time since. What brought this back into sharp focus for me, more than a year later, was a conversation with an outfitter who runs trips into that same general region, a man who spent over 30 years guiding parties through the boundary waters and who I trust enormously for his practical, unsentimental read on backcountry incidents. Someone who's talked dozens of inexperienced clients down from panic over perfectly ordinary wildlife encounters and who I'd expect, if anyone, to have a sensible, deflating explanation ready. I mentioned the Portage by name, without elaborating much on what had happened, mostly just to ask if he knew the trail, framing it as idle curiosity rather than anything urgent. He went quiet in a way that told me something before he said a word, the particular quiet of someone deciding how much to share with a client who might think less of his operation for what he was about to say, weighing, I imagine, his business reputation against whatever honesty he owed me as someone who'd clearly already had an experience of his own. He told me, eventually, that he'd heard variations of the same story from at least 4 other parties over the years, always involving that specific portage or one nearby on the same lake system, always involving the sensation of being paced through the trees, and in at least 2 cases, something circling a camp at night with the same low, even breathing I'd described, details he hadn't fed me himself, since I'd been deliberately vague going in. He said he didn't have a theory and didn't really want one, that the wilderness he guided people through was vast enough and old enough that he'd stopped expecting every strange account to resolve into something tidy, a kind of professional humility about the limits of his own 30 years of experience that I found more reassuring than any confident explanation would have been. He said the stories never escalated beyond what I'd described, pacing, circling, breathing, nothing that had ever turned aggressive or caused harm to anyone he'd guided or heard about, and that for that reason, he'd never felt the need to steer people away from that particular portage, treating it instead as one of several spots in that wilderness with a quiet reputation among people who paddle there often enough to compare notes across different seasons and different groups. I asked him, before we ended the conversation, whether he'd personally experienced anything himself in 3 decades of leading trips through that exact area. He paused for a long moment, then admitted that he had, once, early in his career, a single night of pacing along a different but nearby portage that he'd never told clients about directly, treating it ever since as something he simply factored privately into how he planned routes, occasionally steering larger groups toward alternate trails for reasons he never fully explained to the people he was guiding. I've been back into that same general area twice since, on different routes that pass within several miles of that portage without crossing it directly, and I haven't gone out of my way to avoid it entirely, though I'll admit some part of that avoidance has been deliberate rather than coincidental. The way you might find perfectly reasonable logistical justifications for a route that happens to skip past the one trail you'd rather not think too hard about revisiting. I still do long wilderness canoe trips every summer, still go deep enough into genuinely remote country that days pass without seeing another party, and I haven't let that one night change my relationship with the activity in any fundamental way, because the solitude that makes that kind of trip possible is also exactly what makes it worth doing in the first place. But I think about that pacing presence in the trees more than almost anything else from 20 years of paddling that region, and about the low, even breathing that circled our camp close enough to hear clearly in the stillness after midnight. I don't know what was out there, and neither does the outfitter who spent 3 decades hearing variations of the same handful of stories from parties who otherwise have nothing in common except having crossed the same stretch of Portage Trail at different times in different years, with no way to have influenced each other's accounts beforehand. Whatever it is, it seems content to be heard rather than seen, paced alongside rather than confronted directly, and that small, consistent restraint is the only thing that lets me believe, most days, that it's safe enough to keep going back. The trail camera. I run a small piece of family land in northern Wisconsin, about 200 acres of mixed hardwood and swamp that's been in my family for 3 generations, mostly used for deer hunting in the fall and otherwise left alone the rest of the year. Like most people who manage land that way, I keep a handful of trail cameras up year-round, game cameras, motion-triggered, the kind that take a still photo or a short video clip whenever something crosses in front of the sensor and saves it to a memory card you collect every few weeks. They're a cheap, reliable way to track deer movement and population without spending every weekend physically out there disturbing the land you're trying to observe. I've run cameras on that property for about 9 years now. I know what normal output looks like: deer at all hours, the occasional bear in late summer working through the oak stands, raccoons and foxes at night, the rare bobcat that makes for a good photo to show people. You build up an intuition for what's ordinary after enough seasons of pulling cards and scrolling through hundreds of images at a time, most of them nothing, a handful of them worth keeping, and you also learn the specific quirks of your own equipment, which cameras trigger on swaying branches, which ones have a flash that washes out anything within 15 feet, which ones reliably catch the small stuff that the others miss. This was 2 years ago, late October, about a week before the start of rifle season, when I went out to pull cards from 4 cameras spread across the property before the season got busy. 3 of the cards were entirely ordinary. Deer movement increasing the way it does right before the rut. A few coyotes, nothing remarkable. The 4th camera was set on a trail that ran along the edge of the swamp, in a spot I'd chosen because deer reliably funneled through there moving between a feeding area and thicker cover, a spot that had been one of my more productive camera locations for years running, which is part of why I'd never thought to question it before that particular card. That 4th card had something on it I still don't have an explanation for. Most of the card was normal, deer, a few squirrels triggering the sensor for no good reason, the usual noise that comes with motion-activated cameras in a place with that much wildlife traffic. But there was a sequence of 3 photos, taken about 4 seconds apart according to the timestamps, time-stamped at 2 in the morning on a night I had no other unusual activity logged on any of my other cameras, that showed something I've gone back to look at more times than I'd like to admit, more times, honestly, then I think is good for me. Scrolling back through the same 3 frames on quiet evenings looking for some detail I might have missed that would finally let the whole thing settle into an ordinary explanation. The first photo in the sequence showed the trail empty. Nothing notable, the kind of frame you'd normally discard without a second look, except that it was the first in a sequence that got stranger. The second photo, 4 seconds later, showed what I can only describe as a human-like shape standing at the edge of the frame, mostly in shadow, taller than the markers I have on nearby trees for scale, which I use specifically to judge deer size, and which put this shape at somewhere around 7 feet if it was standing on the ground the camera was aimed at. I want to be careful here, because trail camera photos at night, lit by infrared flash, do strange things to shape and shadow, and I know that better than most people, having looked at thousands of them over the years, across multiple camera models with different flash ranges and different sensor qualities. Branches catch the flash at odd angles and read as limbs. A deer standing at a strange angle relative to the lens can produce a silhouette that doesn't immediately look like a deer. I've talked myself through every one of those explanations for this photo, repeatedly, methodically, the way you'd work through a checklist, and none of them quite account for what's actually in the frame. The shape in that second photo had what looked like 2 clearly defined legs, proportioned more like a person's than any quadruped I'm familiar with, and an upper portion that was harder to make out due to the angle and the shadow, but that didn't read as antlers, didn't read as the elongated neck of any animal native to that part of Wisconsin, and didn't read as a person standing normally either, because the proportions were wrong in a way I can describe but not fully explain, too tall for the apparent build, with limbs that seemed slightly too long relative to the torso, the kind of subtle wrongness that's hard to put into words but unmistakable once you've stared at the image long enough. I tried, several times over the following weeks, to recreate something similar using a tripod and a coat draped over a branch at roughly the same distance from a different camera, just to see if I could reproduce the effect with mundane materials and prove to myself it was nothing. I couldn't get anything that looked remotely close, not the proportions, not the way the shadow fell, not the apparent solidity of the shape against the lighter background of the trail behind it. The third photo, another 4 seconds later, showed the trail empty again. No motion blur trailing off to one side that would suggest something walking quickly out of frame, no partial shape at the very edge that would suggest a normal departure. Just empty trail, the same as the first photo, as if whatever had been there in the middle frame had simply not been there for the 2 photos bracketing it. I checked the camera's trigger interval afterward, going back through the manual and confirming the model's actual minimum time between consecutive triggers, because my first thought was that there might have been a 4th photo in between that the camera had failed to capture due to a slow write speed on the memory card. The interval checked out fine. There was no missing frame, no gap where a transitional image should have been. Whatever moved through that space did so entirely within, or entirely around, the 4-second windows on either side. I sat with those 3 photos for a long time before I showed them to anyone. My first instinct, the responsible instinct, was that it was a person, someone trespassing on the property, maybe a poacher scouting ahead of the season, and that the strange proportions were some trick of posture or clothing that I wasn't accounting for properly. I checked the surrounding area carefully over the following days, looking for any sign of human presence, boot prints, ATV tracks, cigarette butts, anything that would support the idea of a person out there at 2 in the morning a week before season. I found nothing. The ground in that section holds prints well after rain, and it had rained 2 days before the photos were taken. There should have been something if a person had walked through there, especially someone tall enough to register the way this shape did, who would have left a correspondingly deep and obvious impression in the softened ground. I widened my search the following weekend, walking a much larger radius around the camera location than I normally would, checking deer trails branching off in every direction in case whoever or whatever it was had approached from an angle I hadn't considered. I found ordinary deer sign throughout, fresh scat, a couple of rubs on saplings consistent with the season, nothing remotely human, and nothing that read as any kind of unusual animal sign either. No claw marks, no unusually large or strangely shaped prints in the softer mud near the swamp's edge, nothing that gave me anything concrete to work from beyond the 3 photographs themselves. I eventually showed the photos to a friend of mine who does wildlife photography professionally, someone with a much sharper technical understanding of how infrared trail cameras render shape and shadow than I have, hoping he'd be able to point to some obvious explanation I was missing, a known artifact, a common misread, something in the file metadata that would clear it up. He looked at them for a long time without saying much, zooming in on his laptop screen, adjusting brightness and contrast on a couple of editing passes, then told me, carefully, that he didn't have an explanation either, and that in 15 years of working with similar equipment professionally, he'd never seen an artifact that produced exactly that kind of consistent, 3-dimensional seeming shape with that particular proportion of limb to torso. He pointed out a few things that, if anything, made the photo harder to dismiss rather than easier. The shadow cast by the shape fell in a direction consistent with the angle of the infrared flash, the same as the shadows cast by the trailside vegetation in the same frame, which ruled out the simplest explanation of a double exposure artifact or a reflection bouncing in from some unrelated light source. The apparent texture along what would have been the shape's lower legs picked up the same kind of fine-grained noise you'd expect from an actual physical surface lit by that specific flash at that specific distance, rather than the flatter, more uniform noise pattern you typically see in a misread shadow or a piece of foliage catching the light at a strange angle. He also pulled up a couple of his own archived false positive shots from years of fieldwork, side by side with mine, specifically to show me what an actual branch and shadow misread tends to look like under similar lighting, and the comparison didn't do me any favors. His examples looked obviously wrong once you knew what to look for, flat and inconsistent in a way mine simply wasn't. He asked if he could keep a copy of the photos to show around to some contacts of his in the field, other photographers and camera trap researchers, partly out of professional curiosity and partly, I think, because he wanted a second and third opinion before he was willing to say much more about it himself. I said yes. He came back to me about 3 weeks later and said that 2 people he'd shown it to had similar reactions to his own, genuine uncertainty rather than a quick dismissal, and that one of them, a researcher who'd spent years running remote camera traps in mountain lion country out west, said the proportions reminded her of nothing she'd documented in her own substantial archive of camera trap anomalies, most of which turn out to be misidentified animals once you study them carefully enough, under better light or from a different angle in a follow-up capture. I kept that camera up at the same spot for the rest of that season and through the following year, partly out of a genuine desire to see if it happened again, and partly because some part of me wanted to prove to myself that it had been a one-time fluke I could eventually rationalize away with enough additional, ordinary data. Nothing else like it showed up. Thousands more photos, all of them entirely normal, deer and coyotes and the occasional bear, nothing remotely resembling that shape in the 2 years since. What unsettled me almost as much as the photos themselves was a conversation I had with an older hunter who leases a neighboring piece of property, a man who's hunted that general area of the county for over 40 years and who I trust to be plain-spoken rather than prone to exaggeration. He's not a man given to embellishment in general. I've hunted alongside him on shared boundary lines for most of a decade and never once heard him stretch a story about a deer he'd taken or missed, which in deer camp culture is itself a kind of remarkable restraint. I hadn't told him anything about the photos when I brought it up. I asked him, in a roundabout way, whether he'd ever seen or heard anything strange on his land near the swamp edge that bordered my property. He went quiet for a moment, the way people do when they're deciding whether a question is being asked seriously or as a joke, and then said that he'd had a couple of his own trail cameras malfunction in exactly that section of swamp edge over the years. Not malfunction in the sense of breaking, but in the sense of producing images he'd deleted without showing anyone because he didn't have a good way to explain them and didn't want to be the guy at deer camp known for seeing things in his photos. That admission alone told me something, because this is a man who has never, to my knowledge, deleted a single trail camera photo in his life out of simple habit. He keeps everything, going back years, on an old external hard drive he's proud of maintaining. The fact that he'd made an exception, more than once, for whatever those particular images showed, carried more weight with me than almost anything else in this whole account. He wouldn't describe the images in detail, even when I pushed gently, just said that they'd shown something tall, in shadow, near the swamp, and that he'd never set a camera in that exact stretch again afterward. I asked roughly how many times this had happened to him over the years, and he said 3, maybe 4, spread out over what he estimated was close to a decade, infrequent enough that he'd been able to convince himself each time that it was a one-off, an equipment fluke, something he didn't need to think about until the next time it happened, and the convincing had to start over again from scratch. I asked him if he wanted to see my photos. He said no, firmly, in a way that told me he meant it, and that he'd rather not have a clearer picture of something he'd already decided he didn't want to think about more than he had to. I respected that and didn't push further. We've never really discussed it since, beyond an occasional, oblique acknowledgement between us that we're both staying away from the same general stretch of swamp edge for reasons neither of us feels like spelling out anymore. Usually just a nod or a brief comment about how the deer have been moving elsewhere this year, which we both understand to mean more than it says. I still hunt that property every fall. I still run trail cameras across most of it, because 9 years of data is too valuable to abandon over one strange night 2 years ago. But I moved that particular camera to a different trail the following season, further from the swamp edge, and I haven't second-guessed that decision once, even though the rational part of you knows a different location wouldn't actually prevent anything if whatever produced those 3 photos wanted to be photographed again somewhere else on the property. I've thought about pulling all the cameras entirely more than once, just to remove myself from the position of potentially documenting something like that again. But I keep deciding against it, partly out of stubbornness and partly because the data genuinely matters to how I manage the land for hunting purposes. I've also, on a few occasions since, looked into whether there's any kind of documented regional folklore specific to that area of northern Wisconsin that might predate my own experience, the way some regions have long-standing stories attached to particular kinds of terrain. I found scattered references online to similar accounts from hunters and trail camera enthusiasts across the broader Northwoods region, vague enough and inconsistent enough in their details that I don't put much weight on them individually, but consistent enough in the broad shape, tall, shadowed, photographed briefly and then never again in the same spot, that I no longer assume my own experience was entirely isolated, even setting aside what my neighbor told me. I don't know what walked through that frame for 4 seconds at 2 in the morning, leaving no tracks in ground that should have held them, photographed clearly enough that the only ambiguity is in the shape itself rather than the fact that something was there. I know that another experienced landowner, on adjoining property, with no prompting from me, described almost exactly the same thing happening to his own cameras over the years, and that he made the same decision I eventually made without either of us discussing it first. Whatever is out there near that swamp edge, it isn't only showing itself to me, and I've made my peace with not knowing more than that, even if that peace is a little uneasier than I'd like it to be most nights when I'm out there alone checking a card after dark. The Treeline. I've been backpacking solo for about 12 years now, mostly in the northern Rockies, Montana, Idaho, a little bit of Wyoming when the permits work out. I started doing it alone after a few trips with friends fell through on scheduling, one too many times, and I found out pretty quickly that I liked it better that way. No negotiating pace, no waiting on anyone, nobody to perform cheerfulness for when the weather turns or the mileage gets long. Just you and the trail and whatever decisions you make about your own risk tolerance, answerable to nobody else for them. This was 4 years ago, a route I'd done part of once before but never finished. A multi-day traverse through a wilderness area in central Idaho that doesn't see much traffic even in peak season, mostly because the trailhead access requires a rough Forest Service road that knocks a lot of casual hikers out before they even get their boots on. The kind of place where the trail register might show 3 or 4 other parties over an entire month. I want to say up front that I know how to do this. I'm not describing someone careless or inexperienced wandering into something over their head. I'd done over 100 nights solo in the backcountry by that point, knew how to read weather coming in off a ridge, knew how to pick a campsite for water and wind and exposure, knew the difference between something that sounds dangerous and something that just sounds unfamiliar. That distinction matters for what follows, because I've turned this story over in my head specifically looking for the places where inexperience might explain it away, and I haven't found one. Day 3 of the trip, I made camp in a spot I'd scouted on the map beforehand, a bench of relatively flat ground just below the Treeline, with a stand of subalpine fir behind me for a windbreak and an open slope above that ran up to bare rock and eventually a ridge. Good water source nearby, a seasonal creek still running despite it being late in the season, good visibility in most directions, the kind of site that checks every box you're trained to look for when you're choosing where to spend a night alone at 9,000 feet. I got camp set up in the late afternoon, did the usual routine of hanging my food well away from the tent on a line strung between 2 trees, and settled in to read for a while before it got properly dark, the way I always do to wind down after a long day on trail. Nothing felt wrong. I want to be clear about that, because what happened afterward makes more sense if you understand that the lead-up was completely unremarkable. No strange animal behavior earlier in the day, no sense of being watched on the approach, nothing that primed me to expect anything. It was maybe an hour after full dark when I heard the first set of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere above my camp, up where the trees gave out to open slope. Not running, not even particularly quick, just a steady, even cadence, like something walking a line back and forth with no particular urgency. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened, doing the mental checklist anyone who spends time around large wildlife does automatically. Too rhythmic for a deer picking through brush, too quiet, and even for an elk. No huffing or grunting that would suggest a bear working the area for food smell, no scrabbling that would suggest something smaller moving through loose rock. It stopped after maybe 30 seconds. I told myself it was a deer, despite the gait not quite matching what I knew deer to sound like, because a deer was the explanation that let me go back to sleep, and on a solo trip 4 days from the nearest road, that's a real and practical consideration. You can talk yourself out of an alarm response when the alternative is lying awake all night over something you can't verify either way, and exhaustion does a lot of the convincing for you if you let it. About 20 minutes later, it started again. Same cadence. Same general direction, more or less, though it seemed to have shifted slightly, moving along what I was starting to picture as a rough arc above my campsite, out to one side, a pause of several seconds, then back toward the other, like something pacing the edge of where the trees met open ground, the way a dog will pace a fence line it isn't allowed to cross. I got out of my tent that time, which in retrospect probably wasn't the safest move if it had been a predator working out whether I was worth the trouble, but the not knowing had become harder to tolerate than the risk of finding out. I had my headlamp, turned it up toward the Treeline, swept it slowly across the slope, doing my best to cover the whole arc I thought I'd been hearing rather than just the spot where the sound had most recently stopped. Nothing. No eye shine. No movement. No shape breaking from the dark the way you'd expect if something solid was standing there reflecting light back at you. Just trees, black and motionless, and past them, the pale gray of open scree under a quarter moon, empty all the way up to where it met the ridgeline against a slightly lighter sky. I stood there for a long minute, telling myself the obvious things. That sound travels strangely at elevation, bouncing off rock faces and carrying further than it has any business carrying. That an animal could have moved before the light reached it, slipping behind a tree trunk or dropping below a rise. That I was tired from 12 miles of trail that day and probably hearing things with more shape and intention than they actually had. I went back into the tent. I didn't sleep well, but I told myself that not sleeping well wasn't the same as something being wrong, which is a distinction that's easier to make in your head than to actually believe at 1 in the morning alone on a mountain. The pacing came back 4 more times that night, by my count. Always the same unhurried rhythm, always from somewhere along that same arc above the Treeline, never closer, never further, as if whatever it was had decided on a fixed distance and intended to keep it. Each time I checked, my headlamp found nothing. Each time it stopped before I could decide whether to do anything more than look, leaving me holding a flashlight on an empty slope feeling, frankly, a little foolish, which was almost worse than feeling frightened. Toward what I guessed was around 4 in the morning, going by the faint shift in how dark the sky had gotten, it simply didn't come back, and I got maybe 2 hours of genuine sleep before first light, the kind of sleep that doesn't actually rest you, just passes the time until you can reasonably get up. In the morning, I did what anyone with field experience does after a night like that. I checked for tracks, methodically, the way you'd survey a scene rather than just glance around and reassure yourself. The ground around my campsite was soft enough in places, a mix of dirt and scree dust that held an impression well, that anything walking through repeatedly over several hours should have left something obvious. I spent close to 40 minutes working the slope above camp in full daylight, checking the most likely lines a pacing animal would have worn, the places where repeated passage would compress dirt or disturb the loose rock in a pattern, even crouching down at several points to check at an angle where morning light would catch a depression I might otherwise miss. I found nothing. No prints, no disturbed scree, no scat, no hair caught on the low brush that grew in patches along that slope, nothing pressed into the dirt at the edges of the trees where the sound had seemed to originate most consistently. I'm experienced enough at reading sign that I don't think I missed something obvious through carelessness. A bear or a big cat working that same line 5 separate times over several hours, on ground that soft, should have left something for me to find, even accounting for a single pass being hard to spot. It hadn't, and the absence bothered me more than any track would have. I broke camp and moved on with the rest of the route that day, more rattled than I wanted to admit to myself, checking over my shoulder more than I usually do on a stretch of trail with good visibility, and told myself I'd chalk it up to one of those things that happens in the backcountry that you never fully resolve, the kind of story you tell once at a campfire and then mostly keep to yourself. I finished the traverse without further incident. No more pacing, no more footsteps in the night. 2 more uneventful camps before I reached the trailhead on the far end, drove home, and didn't think about it as anything more than a strange night for close to 2 years. I did mention it, a few weeks after I got home, to a friend of mine who works as a wildlife biologist for the state, mostly because she's the person I usually go to when I want a sober, scientifically minded read on something rather than a campfire reaction. I described the pacing, the arc, the lack of vocalization, the absence of any sign the next morning, and asked her, point blank, whether there was anything in the regional fauna that behaved that way. She thought it over carefully, the way she does with most questions, and said the closest analog she could think of was territorial pacing in canids, which didn't quite fit because of the silence, or possibly a mountain lion working out whether prey was worth the risk, which didn't fit the duration or the rigid back-and-forth pattern. She said cats are usually more patient and more direct, less inclined to repeat a pass 5 separate times over several hours without ever closing the distance. She didn't have an answer for me, and she said so plainly, which is part of why I trust her read on it. She wasn't interested in forcing a tidy explanation onto something that didn't actually fit one. What brought it back was a conversation with another solo hiker I met at a trailhead register 2 summers later, in a completely different part of the same general wilderness complex, maybe 40 miles from where I'd had my own experience, accessed from an entirely different road on the opposite side of the range. We got to talking the way solo hikers sometimes do at a trailhead, comparing notes on routes and water sources and the condition of a creek crossing further up, and somewhere in that conversation she mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd had a strange night a season earlier near a different drainage in the same range, a story she said she didn't usually bring up with strangers. I didn't prompt her. I want to be clear about that, because the detail that follows only matters if it was offered without leading, without me having said anything about pacing or arcs or treelines beforehand. She said she'd camped near Treeline, much like I had, heard something pacing back and forth above her camp for most of a night, slow and even, no vocalizations of any kind, nothing that matched any animal she could identify despite years of experience hiking in grizzly country, where she'd learned to be confident about what she was hearing. She'd checked for sign in the morning, just as I had, and found nothing either, on ground she described as soft enough that it should have shown something. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, keeping my voice neutral so as not to lead her, whether the pacing had seemed to follow a kind of arc, back and forth along roughly the same line each time, rather than just wandering randomly the way an animal foraging might. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it rather than just agreeing to be agreeable, and said yes. That was exactly the word she would have used if I hadn't said it first. An arc, like something walking a boundary rather than actually going anywhere, patrolling rather than searching. She hadn't told many people about it, she said, because there's no way to describe an absence of sign without sounding like you're either lying or losing your grip on what actually happened out there alone in the dark, and she'd rather keep her credibility with the hiking partners she still occasionally had than offer up a story that made her sound unreliable. I told her my own version then, full detail, the footsteps, the 4 return visits, the empty slope under my headlamp, the 40 minutes spent failing to find a single track. We sat with that for a while at the trailhead, pack still on our backs, neither of us offering a theory that satisfied either of us, just trading the same details back and forth to make sure we'd actually heard each other right. What we landed on, eventually, wasn't an explanation so much as a shared sense of relief that neither of us had to be the only person carrying it around. 2 different drainages, 2 different years, the same wilderness complex, the same essential shape to the experience, pacing without source, an arc instead of a path, ground that gave nothing back the next morning despite hours of repeated passage in the dark. We exchanged numbers before we split off onto different trails, and we still check in once or twice a year, mostly to ask if the other has had another night like it. So far, neither of us has. I've thought a great deal since then about what large mammals do and don't do in terms of patrol behavior, territorial pacing along boundary lines, that kind of thing, reading more on animal behavior than I probably needed to put the question to rest one way or another. Wolves do something like it, marking and remarking a perimeter as part of normal territorial behavior, but wolves vocalize regularly while doing it, and what I heard never made a sound beyond footfall, not once across 5 separate passes over several hours. Bears don't typically patrol a fixed arc through the night either. They move with purpose toward food or away from threat, in lines that make sense given wind and smell, not back and forth along an invisible boundary for hours with no apparent goal. I still backpack solo. I haven't let it change the basic shape of how I spend my time outdoors, because I think if you let every unexplained night keep you off trail, you'd eventually have no trail left to walk. And most of what makes solo backcountry travel worth the risk is exactly the kind of solitude that also makes nights like that one harder to explain away. But I'm more attentive now to where I pitch a tent relative to a Treeline, choosing sites further from that particular transition zone when I have the option. And there's a particular kind of quiet, late at night, at elevation, where the trees give out to open rock, that I notice myself listening into a little harder than I used to, waiting to hear whether anything is walking the edge of it. I've gone back to that same general drainage twice since, on different routes that pass within a few miles of the original campsite without quite returning to it, partly out of curiosity and partly because I haven't been able to fully convince myself to avoid the area altogether. Neither return trip produced anything unusual. Both times I camped lower, well below Treeline, in spots with more tree cover on all sides, and both times I told myself that the difference in outcome was just ordinary variance, nothing more, even though some part of me suspects I chose those lower sites specifically because I didn't want to find out whether the arc was still being walked. I don't know what was pacing above my camp that night, or above hers a year later and 40 miles distant, in a part of the range with its own separate access and its own separate trail system, with no reasonable way for the same animal to have been the explanation for both nights unless it ranged across more territory than anything in that ecosystem typically does. I know it moved with intention along a boundary it seemed to be choosing for itself, and that whatever it was left nothing behind for either of us to find when the light came up, no matter how carefully either of us looked. That absence has stayed with me longer than almost any track or sign ever has, because at least a track gives you something to measure against, something to compare to a field guide and put a name to. This gave us only the shape of a sound, twice, in 2 different years, in the same wild country, and no way to put a name to what made it. Only the matching word the two of us reached for independently, the word that still comes back to me on quiet nights near a Treeline, an arc.